Some say his music is some of the most depressing ever written, as it was written by a man who was so consumed by solitude that he professed a sympathy for criminals and outcasts. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Alan Peterson. Gustav Alan Peterson was born in September 1911 into a poor Swedish family. He and his three siblings grew up in a dirty, rat-infested single-room apartment in the working-class district of Stockholm. His father was a bitter, abusive, alcoholic blacksmith, and his mother tried her best to make up for his inadequacies. She was a pious and church-going type, and she accompanied herself on guitar singing Salvation Army hymns. It's through her that young Alan first got into music. By selling Christmas cards on the streets when he was 10 years old, he scraped together enough money to buy a violin, but he didn't know how to play it, much to the anger of their neighbors. Music was the foremost of his many interests as a child, but it was one that his father hated, and on several occasions, young Alan was beaten for it. To all of his other interests, his father was merely indifferent. I'm starting to think that this Carl Victor Peterson fella really deserves to step on Lego every couple of minutes. Peterson's career in music began in pubs, music halls, movie theaters, and amusement parks, essentially teaching himself as he learned his instrument. When he was 19, he entered Stockholm's Royal Swedish Academy of Music on his third attempt, and there he studied viola and started getting into composition. He got good enough at the viola to earn a living at it, and he pursued composition lessons on the side. Despite his successes, which included winning the Royal Swedish Academy's Jenny Lind Prize after 9 years of study there, his father disowned him because he felt like his pursuit of music was abandoning his working-class roots, and he never felt at home amongst the other students because they came from middle or upper-class backgrounds and they just never got along with him. It was also very difficult for him to complete the rigorous piano exercises because he didn't have a keyboard at home. The Jenny Lind Prize meant that after his graduation in 1939, he had the opportunity to study abroad. Initially, he wanted to come to America and study with Paul Hindemith, the composer and violist, but instead chose to go to Paris to study with Maurice Vieux. Somehow Peterson didn't realize that the Germans were invading. He only found out when Vieux stood him up for a lesson because Vieux had fled the country. The Swedish consulate sent him back home, where he got an orchestra job, but his refusal to conform himself to an orchestral playing style isolated him from the rest of the players. Despite his abilities on the instrument, he became increasingly bitter about performing with an orchestra. He was good enough, apparently, to have been offered the position of section leader at one point, but he turned it down because he wanted more free time to work on his compositions, even though at this point he wasn't getting any of them performed. It took a while for Peterson to reach compositional maturity. The earliest piece of his that's still in the repertoire are his 24 Barfotasanger, or Barefoot Songs, a song cycle for voice and piano composed in the mid-1940s to his own cryptic texts about growing up poor. This hour-long song cycle would inform later pieces, as Peterson made a habit of quoting selections from the Barefoot Songs or using bits and pieces of them as the seeds of later pieces, to expand them out in perhaps a later symphony. The mood of sadness that pervades the Barefoot Songs, as well as the compositional technique of repetition, would come to define much of his later style, and for that reason many commentators have suggested listening to the Barefoot Songs first as a path into understanding Peterson's style. When he was 40, he took a leave of absence from his orchestra job to finish his compositional studies in Paris, where he worked with Arthur Honegger, Darius Milhaud, and René Leibovitz, the latter of whom likely introduced him to 12-tone music. He composed on whatever pianos he could find, typically a Catholic church in the morning and a Swedish church in the evening, the latter of which had a very out-of-tune piano, and Peterson liked the sound of it because he thought it sang. Soon he was working on his first symphony. Among Swedish composers of the time, he studied with Carl Birger Blomdahl, who was 5 years younger than Peterson, but a leading composer of modernist Swedes known as the Mantagsgruppen, or Monday Group, which was a reaction against the conservative nationalist romanticism that they felt had stymied Swedish music for far too long. Blomdahl was an extremely eclectic composer whose influences ranged from the Baroque era to the cutting edge of electronic music, and what he taught Peterson was the importance of motivic development. But for as much as Blomdahl taught Peterson, Peterson's music doesn't sound much like Blomdahl's at all. Analysts have tried to link elements of Peterson's style to things that his teachers taught him, but really Peterson's early quasi-expressionistic symphonies defy categorization, especially when considering the time period. At that point, composers were either writing in a very neoclassical idiom, very conservatively, or on the cutting edge of serial composition. And Peterson did neither of those things. Because no one was writing the music that he was writing, Peterson, as happened many times throughout his life, was left on the outside looking in. This is why he said he felt a connection to criminals and outcasts. Not because he himself was a criminal, but because he could sympathize with their sense of otherness and their desire to not be away from society, to be a part of the whole instead of quarantined. This suffering and a longing for acceptance and freedom would be a main emotional theme for many of his symphonies. While his first symphony, like his 17th, would go unfinished, it sparked a trend towards symphonic composition, from which Peterson would never look back. But disaster struck because he was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, a disease for which the Swedish doctors had neither solution nor amelioration. His sister had been diagnosed with the same illness years prior. It stunted her growth, and the doctors could do nothing to dull her pain until she eventually threw herself out of a window and died in the hospital. His performing career, which he'd all but abandoned when he went to Paris, was now officially over. Later in life, he said that the diagnosis didn't fundamentally change his situation because he was already an outcast and very lonely. Despite this, he pressed on and produced an average of a symphony every 2 years for the next decade, culminating in 1962's Fifth Symphony. This was the last symphony of his that he could write a performance-suitable fair copy with his hands due to his rheumatoid arthritis. Peterson's works, while they were not well known, were bold and innovative enough that the Swedish government gave him a lifetime pension. A high honor, you might think, but not unheard of in Scandinavian countries. He devoted the middle of the 1960s to a groundbreaking Sixth Symphony, followed up soon thereafter by his Seventh Symphony. Peterson fans will tell you to start with the Seventh Symphony because it so effectively captures Peterson's style. It was a 1969 recording of this piece with the Stockholm Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Antal Dorati, that brought Peterson to international attention. As with many orchestral composers, Peterson's rise to fame was augmented by conductors who believed in and championed his music. For Anton Bruckner, this was Hans Richter. For Jean Sibelius, it was Robert Kajanus. And for Peterson, it was both Dorati and Sergio Commissiona, who commissioned him to premieres and recordings, even though Commissiona found it difficult to program Peterson's symphonies with any regularity given their length. While the Seventh and Eighth Symphonies brought Peterson international attention, the Ninth seemed to do its best to do him in. In 1970, he spent 9 months in the hospital due to a severe kidney ailment. And from his hospital bed, he started writing his 10th Symphony. The man was just undaunted. And considering the harsh and depressing conditions, it's amazing that he wrote anything at all. He was stuck in his 4th-floor apartment for most of his life because he had severe arthritis and not to mention all these other medical issues, and his building did not have an elevator. His wife was his only friend. There was construction noise across the street, there was rock music blaring out between the thin walls from his neighbors, and he somehow found the energy to write 6 symphonies in the last decade of his life. He finally was able to move to a first-floor apartment in the last 2 years of his life, but it was just too late. He died from cancer in June 1980, just 3 months shy of his 69th birthday. Peterson's musical style is unmistakable. He takes an abstract approach towards tonality and form, and he straddles the line between tonality and atonality. Waves of dissonance break over moments of staticism, and his melodic chromaticisms are reminiscent of Bartók. Shostakovich, too, is another perhaps more familiar composer with which Peterson is often compared, and the comparison does make sense. Both wrote a lot of symphonies, both had very painful and depressing lives, but in Shostakovich there's more irony, there's more whimsy, there's more of a grit to it, of laughing in the face of one's tormentors. With Peterson, it's more resignation about the depressing nature of the human condition. It's difficult to characterize Peterson's language without stretching for analogies to the works of other composers with which listeners might be more familiar. As soon as you think you found an analogy or an analog to another composer, he does something a little bit different. We do know that he wanted linearity and singularity in his compositional structures, something that he seems to have gotten from his teacher Blomdahl. This is why some of his most popular symphonies, numbers 5, 6, 7, and 9 if you're keeping score at home, are cast in one-movement forms. Which is easy to do if you're talking about, 25 minutes of music, but not when you're stretching out pieces for over an hour. There's a link to the sense of openness and expansiveness you get in, say, Sibelius or Mahler, but Peterson's approach to form was entirely his own, and he especially disliked being compared to Mahler. Mahler's music tends to be more fluid and open. There's a more kaleidoscopic sense of orchestration, and he embraces a joy of life as much as he embraces the specter of death. Whereas with Peterson, aside from exquisitely crafted moments, much of his music is very dark and depressing, really, but in a good way. The arch-shaped symphonic structures of Symphonies 5, 6, 7, and 9 mean that some have classified this as his second phase of compositional development, but I don't buy this because early Peterson is pretty similar to late Peterson, so making these arbitrary distinctions just because he cast these particular symphonies in one movement seems to be just trying to split hairs in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. It must be noted that of his many symphonies, only two, the third and the eighth, are cast in multi-movement forms with breaks between the movements. The others, if they're not in one movement, are practically in one movement because he has movement titles, but he instructs the conductor to play them attacca, i.e. without a break. Peterson's formal approach is one which, like Anton Bruckner, was concerned with timing, both from the piece and movement levels, but also down to the number of measures within individual sections. Yet at the same time, he spoke of music which needed time to mature. So while he was concerned with making sure that everything fell in exactly the right place, he fought against the natural inclination, especially in a largely serial new music environment, to compose by formula or process. Thematic manipulation and development were important, but only if they were subservient to things that made for a large-scale, goal-oriented procedure. Musical cross-references, either within movements, between movements of a larger piece, or even across his entire body of work, are integral to the uniformity of his expressive voice. They support a large-scale structure, and while his music is definitely well-proportioned, it's far from traditionally proportioned. The coda of his Sixth Symphony takes up almost 50% of the runtime of the entire piece.
Whack.
For Peterson, composition was about learning as much as you could from everyone that you could learn it from, and then forgetting all of that and letting your intuition guide you. It was about internalizing the rules, not consciously thinking about the rules. This ability to learn and then return to one's point of departure and then go off in a different direction from there is the key to understanding his works. Technical mastery was only valid for him if he'd absorbed it enough not to understand consciously what you were doing. Despite all the dissonance in his works, Peterson does utilize triadic harmonies in order to express something that was pure or untainted. The triad for him was a pure harmonic sound. After all, what is dissonance if you don't have consonants to compare it to? But dissonance truly meant something to Peterson on a profound philosophical level. For him, dissonance was symptomatic. It represented the unnecessary pain of oppressed people. He represented this by, in his own words, pouring dissonance into an otherwise finished form. The triad was purity, it was freedom, it was the emergence of a suppressed humanity. But once he got there, he couldn't do anything with it. It just didn't sing for him. He could never just work with consonants in one of his pieces because he found the concept of using it formless, and he couldn't bring it to life. While Peterson is known today primarily for his symphonies, his Sixth Concerti, the last of which was unfinished, deserve more than just a passing mention. His second violin concerto achieved some degree of notoriety, not just because it's very long and the violin soloist has to play for almost the entire hour that the work lasts, but he calls for uncomfortable string crossings and high positions on the G string, which contort the violinist's body in a way that they're just not comfortable with or used to. It's just not a technique that any composer really calls for. Being a string player himself, Peterson was well aware of the difficult techniques for which he was calling, another subtle way in which he encoded pain and suffering into his work. "I am not a composer," Peterson once said. "I am a voice crying out something which must not be forgotten, which threatens to be drowned in the noise of the times." Given the recent renewal of interest in his 34 works, Peterson's gripping music isn't going to be drowned out by anyone anytime soon.